There has been a lot of misinformation in the media regarding the US Sanctions Program on Zimbabwe. Today, we want to clear up any confusion by discussing the origins of the Zimbabwe Sanctions Program, the significant impact of US sanctions on Zimbabwe, the long struggle to have these sanctions lifted, and our ongoing efforts to seek reparations for the suffering endured by the people of Zimbabwe. Over the past 2 decades, these illegal sanctions have deeply affected our nation's socio-economic fabric, and it is crucial to understand the full extent of their impact and the steps we are taking to address the injustices faced by our citizens. In the early 2000s, the United States imposed the illegal Zimbabwe Sanctions Program extrajudicially and extraterritorially. These illegal sanctions included executive orders EO 13288, EO 13391, and EO 13469. The sanctions were purportedly introduced in response to perceived political and human rights violations by the Zimbabwean government. However, the reality is that these sanctions were implemented to discourage land reform within Zimbabwe in order to keep Zimbabwean land in the hands of white settlers rather than native Zimbabweans. The sanctions, which collectively targeted national government, local government, state-owned enterprises, investors, financial institutions, mines, farms, as well as any other entities that did business with these sectors, effectively crippled the entire engine of the Zimbabwean economy and were deemed illegal by the UN in 2021. The fact is, the objective of these illegal measures was to pressure the Zimbabwean government to reverse land reform, economic transformation, and to force the Zimbabwean government to return the economy and land to whites. It was also to force electoral reforms which, alongside sanctions, would help achieve quick regime change to an opposition that would return land and economic control to whites. In response to the dire situation, the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, ZSM, was formed and mobilized to advocate for the lifting of these sanctions. Our efforts involved engaging with international bodies, human rights organizations, and lobbying the SADC and the South African government to champion the fight against these illegal sanctions. Eventually, the noise we created got the attention of US lawmakers and members of the US security system who approached us to understand our gripe. We presented arguments and evidence showing the magnitude by which US sanctions contravened and violated international law and human rights principles. From this engagement in April 2021, the US Congress Subcommittee on Health, Human Rights and Organization, led by Karen Bass, would on the 25th of May 2021 begin to undertake their own human rights impact assessment of their own sanctions in Zimbabwe and Africa for the first time in history. That impact assessment would prove that their executive order sanctions on Zimbabwe were depriving Zimbabweans of their enjoyment of their human rights, healthcare and development. From this assessment, the committee wrote a report to Congress and the White House recommending that the US government remove these executive order sanctions that were persecuting civilians and depriving them enjoyment of their human rights. It must be remembered that in 2000, while lobbying for sanctions to be imposed on Zimbabwe, Chester Crocker asked US congressmen and senators to stomach the pain and suffering that would come from making the Zimbabwean economy scream in order to separate the people of Zimbabwe from ZANU-PF. This is a clear indication that there was a deliberate intent by the sanctions sponsors to persecute the Zimbabwean people, to force them to reject their government. This is a clear and gross violation of human rights, if not a crime against humanity. With ZSM's activism raising more awareness against sanctions, American alternative media created documentaries, US organizations held tribunals, and many international humanitarian lawyers grew interested in this humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe. With the mobilization of the SADC, more nations began to voice concerns over the scope and agenda of the US sanctions, arguing that the very nature of the sanctions was resulting in a human rights catastrophe within Zimbabwe, as the sanctions were inevitably affecting Zimbabweans from all walks of life. The imposition of these sanctions had a profound impact on Zimbabwe's ability to provide essential services like healthcare and education. Furthermore, basic needs such as food and clean water were severely restricted. Reports from international organizations and local communities indicate that over 1.3 million Zimbabweans lost their lives due to the compounded effects of these sanctions, which included starvation, waterborne diseases, and lack of medical care. Meanwhile, the sanctions also led to the displacement of approximately 3 million people. These figures highlight the devastating consequences of the sanctions on ordinary Zimbabweans, whose daily lives were disrupted and whose futures were jeopardized. The impact of the sanctions on Zimbabwean citizens was eventually investigated by the UN Human Rights Council in September of 2021, which found the following. Zimbabwe has lost well over $100 billion in revenue and development over the past 19 years because of the sanctions. The significant progress that Zimbabwe had made in the development of infrastructure, as well as health, education, and other social service delivery systems, has been severely reversed due to the lost revenue. The proportion of the population in extreme poverty rose in the aftermath of sanctions, while child mortality, maternal deaths, and deaths from curable diseases increased exponentially due to a lack of medication, medical equipment, and shortages of qualified medical staff due to brain drain caused by displacement. After this extensive advocacy and a thorough assessment by the US government's own Congress subcommittee, it was recommended by US advisors that the sanctions be lifted on Zimbabwe. The subcommittee's findings highlighted the severe deprivation and human rights violations caused by the sanctions, concluding that their continuation was unjustifiable. Consequently, on April 4, 2024, the United States government was pressured to lift the executive order sanctions on Zimbabwe, stating that they intend to refocus the sanctions to make clear that they are not intended to target the people of Zimbabwe. This statement was exceptionally damning for the US, as they openly admitted that the Zimbabwean Sanctions Program can no longer continue, as it is affecting Zimbabwean citizens and therefore needs to be refocused. This decision was met with widespread relief and cautious optimism among the Zimbabwean populace. However, it was clear that the lifting of sanctions, while significant, was only the first step in addressing the long-term damage inflicted on our nation. With the sanctions lifted, the US government has begun an extensive campaign to convince the Zimbabwean people that its sanctions were not and are not on 16 million people. For us, this is a clear attempt by the US government to escape culpability for collectively punishing, persecuting, killing, and underdeveloping Zimbabweans for the past 23 years, because they know that Zimbabweans are entitled to reparations for their gross human rights violations. Our focus at ZASM has now shifted to seeking reparations for the suffering endured by the Zimbabwean people. The legal and moral basis for this pursuit is grounded in international human rights laws, specifically the principle of the right to remedy and reparations for gross human rights violations as recognized by the International Court of Justice. The Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, in collaboration with a coalition of international lawyers, is preparing to take legal action to demand reparations. These reparations are essential not only for acknowledging and addressing past injustices, but also for providing the resources necessary to rebuild our nation and ensuring a better future for all Zimbabweans. I invite all of you to join us in our fight for justice and reparations. Stand with Zimbabweans as we work towards rebuilding our nation and ensuring that those responsible for our suffering are held accountable. Your support is crucial in this endeavor. You can get involved by visiting our website, following us on social media, and contributing to our cause. Together we can make a significant difference and ensure a brighter future for Zimbabwe. Together we stand. Together we fight. Together we will rebuild.